There's something they don't tell you about horses. They don't forget, not places, not smells, not the particular quality of silence that hangs over ground where something important once happened. You can ride a horse 1,000 miles from where it was born, feed it good hay, keep it warm, love it the way a man loves the one thing in his life he hasn't managed to ruin yet. And still, on some cold morning when the light comes in sideways and the wind smells like pine resin and old snow, that horse will lift its head toward the tree line with an expression that has no name in any language you speak. I've kept a log since 1887. Leather-bound, initials pressed into the corner. CMR, Conrad Reardon. Most men my age keep nothing. They say memory is enough. Those men, in my experience, are wrong about most things. What I'm about to tell you happened over the course of 11 days in October of 1891, in the Bitterroot Range of what was then barely called Montana Territory. What I found, what Cinder found, was worth more than any number a bank could print on paper. Though yes, the government eventually put a dollar amount on it. 3 million was what they said. But that came later. First came the trees. First came the silence. First came the man sitting cross-legged in the snow with his eyes closed and his hands open and something between his palms that caught the light the way glass does when it's very, very old. I almost rode past him. I almost did. The log entry for October 4th, 1891, reads, Cinder pulled north again at the fork. Let him weather holding. Ribs on the left side feel wrong when I breathe deep. Note to self, stop breathing deep. That last line was a joke. My jokes have always landed better on paper than out loud. Out loud, people look at me with the expression you give a man who's dropped something in the middle of a crowded room. On paper, the jokes stay exactly as I intended them, which is to say, small, private. A way of acknowledging that the situation I'm in has become slightly larger than I know how to manage. The situation, at that point, I had been riding alone for 6 days through the northern Bitterroot. The situation at a wider angle. I had been riding alone for 6 days through the northern Bitterroot after losing 3 pack horses, a winter's worth of surveying equipment, and what I privately considered my dignity, when the ice shelf above the creek crossing at Hennessy's Gap gave way on October 1st and deposited me, my gear, and my 2 remaining horses into approximately 8 feet of glacial snowmelt, moving at what I later estimated to be considerably too fast for a man with cracked ribs. One horse didn't come up. Cinder did. He was standing on the far bank when I surfaced, bleeding from somewhere on my forehead, coughing water the color of old iron, and he was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as restrained. Like a man who's watched another man make a preventable mistake and has chosen, out of basic decency, not to comment on it. I loved that horse in a way I've never managed to love most people. He was a blood-bay stallion, 16 hands, with a scar along his left shoulder from a cougar encounter 2 years prior that had left a ridge of hair that never grew back the same color. He had a habit of pressing his nose against the back of my neck when he was nervous, which was uncomfortable, and also, in the specific way that only uncomfortable things can be, deeply reassuring. He'd been given to me by a Crow trader named Follows Water in exchange for a Winchester and a promise I mostly kept, and he'd been the most reliable thing in my life for the better part of 3 years. After the creek crossing I had Cinder, 1 saddlebag, the leather log, a skinning knife, 11 rounds of .44 ammunition, half a wedge of hard cheese that had been old before it got wet, and the clothes on my body plus 1 wool blanket that was soaking and did not, over the following hours, stop being soaking. No food beyond the cheese. No map since the map went in with the pack horse. No company. The nearest settlement of any significance was Fort Missoula, which I calculated at somewhere between 60 and 80 miles south depending on how accurately I'd been charting my position before the crossing, which, given the state of the equipment I'd now lost, I had to admit I was not entirely confident about. I needed to go south. That is the relevant context for why it mattered that Cinder kept pulling north. He'd started on the 3rd day after the crossing. The first 2 days he'd been content to follow my lead, or at least he'd been willing to. Cinder had a particular body language for disagreement that I'd come to read the way some men read faces. He'd comply, but his ears would go half back and there'd be a tightening across his withers, a reluctance in the hindquarters that said, I'll do this, but I want you to know I have opinions. On those first 2 days heading south, his opinions were mild. present but manageable. On day 3, they became architectural. We reached the fork in the game trail, a place where the main trace split, one branch continuing south toward the valley floor and the distant gleam of what I believed was the Bitterroot River, the other branch cutting sharp northeast into taller timber, and Cinder stopped. Not slowed, not hesitated, stopped. I pressed my heels in, he stood. I pressed harder. He turned his head and looked at me, which horses do not technically do in any sophisticated way, but which this horse did with an expression of such specific and considered communication that I actually said, out loud to no one, "I know where we need to go." He did not alter his position. "South," I said. He made a sound low in his throat, not a whinny, not quite a snort. Something between the two that I'd come to understand meant, "That is an incorrect statement, but I'll let you finish." I turned him south manually, walking him the first 100 yards until he'd accepted the direction, and we continued. He walked it. But the tightening was there, worse than before, and twice in the next half-mile he stopped and turned his head northeast with an intentness that was starting to unsettle me in ways I hadn't yet articulated to myself. I wrote in the log that night, Cinder disagreeing about direction, maintaining south, logic sound, horse is horse. That last sentence is, in retrospect, one of the more wrong things I've ever committed to paper. By October 4th, I was cold in a way that had become structural. Not cold on the surface, cold inside the architecture of myself, in the places where warmth is supposed to live as a natural state. My ribs had gone from feeling wrong to feeling specific and sharp and wrong, which I diagnosed as either too cracked or one cracked badly, and which I addressed by not pressing my fingers into that side more than once every few hours, which was the only management strategy available to me. The cheese was gone. I'd eaten the last of it on the 3rd morning, sitting on a rock above a frozen stream, watching Cinder drink from a thin ribbon of moving water, and wondering whether gratitude was a feeling you could sustain in the absence of food, or whether it required caloric support. I'd set 2 snares the previous evening, both empty. I was beginning to have a frank internal conversation with myself about the actual timeline of my situation, the kind of conversation that requires you to look at numbers without any of the softening that hope applies to them. 6 days from Hennessy's Gap, 4, maybe 5 days travel remaining to Fort Missoula if the weather held and I could maintain pace. Current pace, slower than needed because of the ribs. Current food supply, 0. Current body temperature, a matter of ongoing concern. Current company, one opinionated stallion who believed with increasing conviction that we were going in the wrong direction. At the fork on October 4th, when Cinder stopped and turned his head northeast again, I sat with it longer than I had before. "Show me," I said, "and I know how that sounds." I've written it in the log and read it back enough times to know exactly how it sounds. But there was a practical consideration underneath the strange one, which was this: if there was something northeast that Cinder had identified, water, shelter, other animals, which might mean other people, then northeast might not be the irrational direction. The rational south was rational only if I could survive it. If I couldn't survive it, the rational south was just a direction I'd die facing. I gave him his head. He went northeast at a walk that had none of the previous reluctance. He went like a horse that knows where it's going, which is a particular gait. There's a fluency to the shoulder, a rhythm that's subtly different from a horse that's being directed. And I sat it and watched the timber close in around us and wrote nothing in the log because my hands were too cold to write legibly, and also because I didn't know yet what to write. The forest changed as we went deeper. I've been in a great deal of western timber. Ponderosa stands that go on like cathedrals, lodgepoles so dense you ride with your knees tucked in and still come out with bark on your jacket. Cedar groves down near the Idaho border where the smell alone could make a man feel briefly and inexplicably religious. I knew mountain forests the way a person knows the rooms of a house they've lived in long enough, not consciously, but in the feet and shoulders, in the way the body adjusts without instruction to changes in terrain and density and light. This timber was different in a way I kept trying to name and couldn't. Older, obviously. The ponderosas here were the diameter of barn walls, with bark that had gone beyond red-brown into something closer to terracotta, a color that made them look lit from inside when the afternoon light came through the canopy at a certain angle. But it wasn't just age. It was the space between them. Most old-growth timber crowds itself, Trees compete for light and resources, and the result is a kind of density that's beautiful but also slightly claustrophobic. These trees stood apart from each other with a deliberateness that felt almost considered, like they'd arranged themselves, like the space between them had been thought about. The undergrowth was minimal. That should have been unremarkable, less light, less undergrowth, but the quality of the ground cover was unusual. Deep pine duff, yes, lichen on the north faces of every trunk, but also in irregular intervals across the forest floor, flat stones that were not the right shape for this geology. Too smooth, too regular in their flatness, not river stones. The rounding was wrong, but stones that had been exposed to water and hands both over a very long time. Cinder moved through this space without sound. His hooves found the duff as though he was placing them intentionally, and the silence that surrounded us was the specific silence of a place that has not been loud in a long time, which is different from the silence of a place that has never been loud at all. I had the unreasonable feeling that I was inside something. Not a forest, something that had been a forest once and was now also a record of other things. He stopped at 4:17 in the afternoon. I know the time because I still had my father's pocket watch, which had survived the creek crossing because it was in my breast pocket, and I had, without thinking, covered it with my left hand when I went under, and which I had checked 6 minutes earlier when the light started going gold. He stopped in a clearing that was not quite a clearing, more a place where the trees had decided not to stand, a rough oval perhaps 40 feet across, carpeted with the same deep duff that was everywhere, but in the center of it there was a different arrangement. Flat stones again, but here deliberate in a way that couldn't be explained by geology. A circle of them, arranged not in a perfect ring. Perfect rings feel human and constructed, but in the way that meaningful things are arranged by people who understand that meaning and symmetry are different qualities. In the center of the circle, sitting cross-legged on a single large flat stone, was a man. He had his eyes closed. His hands were in his lap, palms up, and between them he held something that caught what remained of the afternoon light and threw it in small moving pieces across the ground around him, the way water does when the surface is slightly disturbed. He was Apache. I say this not with the easy certainty of a man who'd spent his life sorting people from a distance, but with the careful recognition of someone who'd spent enough time in the Southwest and in the mountain territories to understand that Apache was not one thing but many, and that what I was looking at, the particular cut of his clothing, the pattern worked into the edge of his blanket, the way he held his body in stillness that was not relaxation but something more intentional, was a man from a tradition I had pieces of, not the whole of. He was old, or rather, he had a particular quality that I came to understand over the hours that followed was not the same thing as age, though it lived in the same part of the face. Something had happened to him, multiple things. And he was still there after all of them, which showed in the set of his jaw and the particular steadiness with which he sat in the middle of that stone circle in October cold, with snow starting to find its way through the canopy overhead. He didn't open his eyes when Cinder stopped at the edge of the circle. He said in English that had an accent I couldn't place, "Your horse found this place before." I didn't say anything. My ribs hurt. My hands were shaking with cold. I was looking at a man in the middle of a stone arrangement in a forest that didn't behave like the other forests I knew, in a place I hadn't been looking for, and the object between his palms was still catching light and throwing it across the ground in those small moving pieces, and I didn't know yet what it was. 3 years ago, he said. A bay horse, scar on the shoulder. He stood where he stands now and watched me for a long time before going. I said, his name is Cinder. I know what he is, the man said. I don't need his name for that. He opened his eyes. They were the color of deep water, not dark exactly, but with a depth to them that made dark seem like a flat description. He looked at me with an assessment that was so thorough and so unsentimental that I had the sudden, clear understanding that whatever I thought I was presenting to this man, frontier surveyor, stranded traveler, competent outdoorsman, he was reading something else entirely. "You're hurt," he said. "I'm fine," I said. He made no expression whatsoever, which was its own expression. "Get down," he said. "There's fire already made on the south side of those trees. Eat first. Then I'll tell you why your horse kept coming back to this place." I should have asked more questions. I should have been more careful. I should have been a lot of things. Instead, I said, "What are you holding?" He looked down at his hands. He turned them slightly, and the light caught the object and threw its patterns differently, and I saw for the first time what it was. A piece of stone, not a flat stone like the ones arranged around him. A different thing entirely, darker, translucent in a way that mineral stone rarely achieves, with interior structures that the light moved through rather than bouncing off of. It was roughly the size of two fists placed together, irregular in shape, and it was doing something to the light that I did not, at that moment, have the geology to explain. "That answer can also wait," he said. "You're going to fall off that horse if you don't get down." He was right about that, too. I got down. His name he told me over the fire, a fire he'd made in a stone-ringed pit on the south side of the clearing, small and efficient, the kind of fire that does exactly what it's required to do and nothing showy beyond that, was Nathan. He offered it without ceremony, the way useful information is offered, and I gave him mine the same way. He had dried meat. He had a bark-covered pack that contained, I gradually came to understand, a remarkable density of things for one man to be carrying alone into October mountains. He gave me meat and a clay vessel of something hot that tasted of unfamiliar herbs and had the immediate effect of making my breathing easier, which I took to be either medicinal or coincidence, and was too grateful for it to interrogate further. He asked me nothing about myself. This was so disorienting that I kept catching myself on the verge of explaining. The surveying job, the creek crossing, the equipment, the plan, and then stopping because he hadn't asked and the explanations felt, in the particular quality of that fire's silence, like noise. Instead, he talked about the place. Not continuously, not as a lecture. In the way that a person who knows something well and has thought about it for a long time delivers it. In pieces, with silences in between that weren't emptiness but were part of the delivery, the way rests in music are part of the music. "This ground has been known for a long time," he said. The fire snapped once. Cinder stood at the edge of the firelight with one hip dropped, which was how he looked when he was comfortable. "Longer than anyone I was taught by could account for. The stones in the circle weren't placed by my people. We found them, or they found us, depending on how you think about finding." I asked how long ago. He considered. "My grandfather's grandfather's time, the eldest in the band, could not remember a time before this place being known. That is not a span of years I can give you a number for." The object, the stone, was beside him. He'd set it on a piece of worn leather, and in the firelight it did something different than it had done in the afternoon light. The interior structures were visible in a different way, and what I'd taken for randomness I now saw was not. There were patterns in there. Regular, repeating, the kind of organization that takes a very specific set of conditions to produce. I'd been near gold fields before, silver camps. I'd heard a man once describe a diamond pipe in South Africa, read about it in a paper, and what he described about the host rock, a specific kind of igneous formation called kimberlite, which he'd pronounced with the reverence miners reserve for things that make their hands shake, had a description that touched something in the edges of my memory now, sitting across a fire from a man named Nathan with a stone between us that was doing things to firelight that stone is not supposed to do. "What is it?" I asked again. He picked it up. He turned it in his hands with a familiarity that said he'd held it many times for many years. "My people call it the heart of this ground," he said. "There's no word for it in what you speak. You would call it—" He paused, not searching for a word. "Something else. You would call it evidence," he said, "of what lives below." "Below the ground." "Below this ground, specifically this ground." He set it down again. The firelight rearranged itself across the interior. "This place is not what it looks like from the outside. What it looks like from the outside is a forest with old trees. What it is from the inside is the top of something very large that has been here since before the trees. I'm a surveyor by trade. I think in geological strata, in mineral signatures, in the behavior of ground that indicates what is and isn't underneath it. And I'm telling you that sitting there with the cold coming in at my back, and the ribs making themselves known with every breath, looking at a piece of stone that I was beginning to understand might be the surface-adjacent indicator of a formation of extraordinary depth and composition, I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with the injury. I wrote in the log later that night by the dying fire, "He is showing me something, not the stone. The thing the stone is the edge of, ribs bad, stay anyway." I stayed 3 nights. During those 3 nights, Nathan told me things in pieces. The way the forest had been used by his people as a boundary marker and a meeting ground. The way the stone circle had been maintained not by one lineage, but by a rotating responsibility among three separate bands who had understood its significance differently from each other and agreed, without language for the agreement, that it was worth maintaining regardless. He told me about a winter 40 years prior when the ground in a section of this forest had opened. Not violently, not dramatically, just opened, the way a very old wound sometimes does when the conditions change, and what had been visible inside for the 3 days before it closed again. He told me what his father had told him about that opening. He told me what he himself had understood it to mean, which was different from what his father had said, and he told me the difference without apology. He asked me, on the second night, what I knew about the ground in this part of the range. I told him what I'd surveyed, which was the valley floors and lower elevations, and what I'd read in the geological papers coming out of the newly established Survey Commission, and what I'd heard from miners working the lower mineral claims to the south. He listened to all of it without expression. Then he said, "None of that is about this place." "No," I said, "none of that is about this place." "You survey," he said. "That means you measure and report what is in the ground to people who will then decide what to do about it." "Roughly, yes. You could survey this place." "I don't have the equipment. It went in a creek." "You have your eyes," he said, "and you have what I know, and you have 3 days before you need to go south again." He looked at me across the fire. "That is a question," he said, shaped like a statement. I said, "I know." He waited. "What do you want from it?" I asked. "If I survey this place and report it?" He was quiet for a long time. The fire was very low. Cinder was a shape in the dark at the edge of the trees. "I want what has been here to be seen," he said finally. "Correctly, not taken, not named, not enclosed." He turned the stone in his hands once slowly. "But seen, accurately, by people who measure things for a living and cannot then pretend they don't know." "That's not how it works," I said, "when I report something like this." "I know how it works," he said, and his voice had something in it that was not anger and not bitterness but was adjacent to both, a kind of knowledge that's been refined by long contact with its own weight. "I know exactly how it works. I am asking you to do it anyway, because if it is not seen, what has happened to everything else happens here." I sat with that. "And if it is seen," I asked. "Then at least it happened in the light," he said. On the third morning, he took me to the place in the forest where the ground had opened 40 years before. It had closed, as he'd said, closed completely on the surface, the duff grown back over it, the stones repositioned. But the trees around it grew differently, leaning away from a central point in a radius that subtended exactly the shape of what had been below. I measured the radius with my stride and estimated the diameter of whatever formation lay underneath. I wrote the number down. Then I looked up and found Nathan watching me and realized he'd already known the number. He just needed me to arrive at it myself. "Your horse came back to this place," he said, "because 3 years ago when you passed nearby he felt it. What is below this ground produces a—" He paused, and I understood he was choosing between several words, each inadequate. "A condition," he said, "in the air. That horses feel before men do, always." I looked at Cinder. Cinder was standing at the edge of the leaning tree radius with his head down, and his nose about an inch from the ground, exactly like a dog on a scent, except that no scent I'd ever heard of came from 100 feet below the earth through 40 years of regrown forest. "How much is below?" I asked. Nathan was quiet. "Do you know?" I asked. "I know enough," he said. "I know it is the reason this place has been kept." He didn't say the number. He'd never said the number. But I looked at the radius I'd measured, and I thought about the geological papers I'd read and the formations they described, and I thought about the piece of stone he'd shown me. Its color, its translucency, the interior structures that were consistent with a very specific and very deep kind of formation. And I thought about $3 million and whether that was a floor or a ceiling. I thought it was probably a floor. I looked at the forest, at the specific silence it had, at the deliberate space between the trees that was not an accident. I wrote in the log, "Stay or go, can measure or not. This is the choice, who does the measuring serve." Below that later I added, "He didn't ask me to stay, that's what made me stay." I want to be honest about who I was before the 11th day. Not who I was on the 11th day, which is a different and more complicated accounting. Before it. The man who arrived in that clearing on October 4th, who got down off a horse because an Apache elder told him to, who ate dried meat and drank herb tea and wrote notes by firelight with cracked ribs. That man was competent, moderately principled, and accustomed to reducing the world to what could be measured, recorded, and submitted in a report to the Montana Territorial Survey Commission with his name in the upper right corner of the cover page. That man had a specific relationship to the land he worked on, professional, interested in what was in it, not in what it meant to anyone except as a category of information. He'd filed 6 reports in 4 years, each detailing subsurface mineral potential in sections of the Bitterroot Range, each received by the Commission with the efficient gratitude of people who needed the information to issue extraction licenses, which is what the reports were ultimately for. He'd been good at the job. He hadn't examined whether the job was good. Nathan spent 4 days not asking him to examine that. Which is, of course, exactly how you get someone to examine it. The 4th morning, October 7th, which was the first morning beyond the 3 days I'd told myself I was staying, I woke before light to find Nathan already gone from the camp and Cinder already awake, which meant that Cinder had heard or sensed Nathan moving and had tracked him with his attention the way he tracked things he'd decided mattered. I followed the horse's gaze. Nathan was at the stone circle, not sitting, standing at the edge of it facing east and doing something that I can only describe as listening in a way that used the whole body. Still in the way that water is still on a day without wind, not empty, just undisturbed on the surface with everything that matters happening below. I wrote in the log, Day 4 should leave today, won't. Not sure yet why won't has won this argument. He came back to camp when the sky had gone from black to the specific gray-purple that precedes true dawn in mountain terrain, and sat down across from the fire ring without restarting the fire. There are men coming, he said. I looked up from the log. 2, maybe 3, south of here following the game trails. They've been in this range for 5 days. He picked up a stick, not to do anything with it, just picked it up and held it. They are not surveyors. The stick he was holding had a thin, nervous energy to it, not in him, but in the way I was receiving the information. Prospectors? I asked. Possibly, he didn't say more than that. I thought about what was below this ground. I thought about what a prospector does when he finds what he thinks is surface evidence of something significant. I thought about the specific and well-documented history of what happened to places after the word got out. How much time? I asked. Today if they're moving well, tomorrow if they're not. I set down the log. My ribs sent a specific complaint about the movement that I noted and ignored. What do you want to do? He looked at me for a moment with that same thorough assessment. I want to know what you will do, he said, before I tell you what I want. It was not a test, or rather, it was not a test in the way I'd initially received it as a challenge of character. It was a genuine question about logistics. He needed to know what I was going to do because what I was going to do would determine what options he had. And he was a man who thought in options, who had been thinking in options for a very long time, and who had survived because of it. I don't know yet, I said. Then tell me when you do, he said, but tell me before they arrive. We heard them mid-morning. 2 men, as it turned out, not 3, traveling with a mule and no particular care for noise, which told you something about their confidence or their inexperience, and possibly both. I heard the mule first, then voices, then the crack of brush that announces someone who hasn't learned yet that the mountain is better navigated quietly. Nathan was not in the camp when they arrived. He'd moved. Where I didn't know, somewhere in the tree line, some position that gave him sight lines I didn't have, and this was not incidental. He'd been doing it all morning, making small adjustments to where he was and what he was facing, the way a man positions himself who has done many calculations about terrain and approach, and has arrived at conclusions he considers reliable. The 2 men came into the edge of my camp with the momentum of people who'd been walking hard and expected to find nothing and found me instead. They stopped. The mule stopped. The older of the 2, a man in his 50s with the weathered density of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and a beard that had opinions about itself, took in the scene with the quick inventory that experienced men do. Horse. Fire ring. Log on lap. Man who appears to have been here a while. Morning, he said, with the tone that is actually a question. Morning, I said, with the tone that answers the question without answering it. His name, I learned in the next 10 minutes, was Beaumont Coyle. The younger man, mid-20s, quick eyes, a nervous quality he was working to suppress, was his nephew called Petch, which was apparently short for something he'd stopped correcting people about. They were out of Helena. They'd been following a geological tip from a paper published by a man named Dressler, who described in a survey journal from 1886 anomalous magnetic readings in a section of the northern Bitterroot that corresponded, roughly, to where we were standing. I knew the Dressler paper. I had a copy of it in my notes, or I had had a copy before the creek. The anomalous magnetic readings in the Dressler paper were, in my considered geological opinion, consistent with one of two formations. An unusually large deposit of iron-rich basaltic intrusion, which was interesting but not particularly valuable. And this was the reading I'd been arriving at across 4 days, and the evidence of one extraordinary piece of stone. The caprock signature of a deep kimberlite pipe with structural characteristics consistent with significant diamond-bearing potential. The Dressler paper didn't name the second option. Dressler wasn't a mineralogist. He'd recorded the readings and noted the anomaly and moved on. Beaumont Coyle, sitting across my fire ring, eating the last of my hard biscuit with the appetite of a man who hadn't eaten well in days, was telling me about the Dressler paper with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a thread they were pulling on. I watched him talk and thought about Nathan, somewhere in the trees, listening to all of this. "You're surveying this area?" Coyle asked. "Was," I said, "equipment situation." He glanced at my single saddlebag, my single horse. He was too experienced to say what happened directly, so he said it with his eyes. "Creek crossing," I said, "north of here." He nodded, storing that. Then, "What have you seen? In the ground up here, I mean, any surface expression of what Dressler was reading?" "Here is where it was." The decision point that Nathan had asked me to think about before they arrived, which I had been thinking about for 2 hours and had not, if I'm being accurate about it, resolved. The honest answer to Beaumont Coyle's question was, yes, surface expression consistent with deep kimberlite, stone samples that support the magnetic readings and then some, a radius measurement of what I believe to be a pipe of extraordinary dimensions, enough to turn this from an anomalous reading into a reportable find. The other answer was not much worth noting, iron-bearing basalt probably, common to this range. In between those two answers was a third one, which I was working toward and which required more seconds to arrive at than I technically had. "Basalt," I said. "Pretty consistent with the valley formations. Nothing that would explain the magnetic readings specifically." Coyle's eyes did something, not quite disappointment, something more like recalibration. "Hun," he said. "If Dressler's readings are accurate," I said, and I made my tone the tone of a man sharing a professional opinion, not a man managing information. "And they usually were, what you're looking at up here is probably a deep intrusive contact zone. Gives you the magnetics, doesn't give you much else." Petch was watching me the way young men watch older men when they're trying to determine whether to believe them. Coyle said, "You file your reports with the commission." "I do." "And you'd put this section down as what?" "Surveyed. No economically significant mineral potential in the surface accessible range." I reached for the log and made myself look like a man doing a normal thing. "That's my read." He looked at me for another moment. Then he exhaled through his nose, that specific exhalation that is not quite disbelief but is not quite acceptance either, and said, "Well, you know better than us." They left the next morning. Not immediately. They camped nearby that night, and I sat with my fire and my log and the knowledge that Nathan was somewhere in the trees, and that I had done a thing that I couldn't yet fully evaluate from where I was standing. Petch came to my fire in the early evening, alone without the uncle. He sat across from me with the directness of a young man who hasn't learned yet to wrap his intentions in courtesy and said, "You know more than what you told him." I looked at him. "I'm not," he stopped, restarted. "I'm not going to do anything with it, I can tell." He had quick eyes like I'd noticed, not aggressive quick, observant quick. There's a difference and it matters. You knew exactly what you were saying when you said basalt. That's not how surveyors say basalt when they mean basalt. How do surveyors say it? Without all that precision around it, he said. I was quiet. I've been in enough assay offices, he said. Listening to enough men describe worthless ground, it sounds different from this. I thought about Natin. I thought about the stone circle. I thought about a man sitting cross-legged in October cold, with something between his palms that had been the top edge of something enormous and patient and very, very old. There are things in this range, I said carefully, that have been here longer than the question of what they're worth. Petch was quiet, processing that. And the people who know them, I said, have been thinking about what happens when someone else finds them for longer than I've been alive. Another silence. The uncle would file a claim, Petch said, flat, not judgment, just fact. Most people would, I said. He looked at the fire, then he said, I won't say anything about this specific spot. To him, I mean, I can say the readings led us to a dead end. Which isn't, that's not entirely false if this is where we ended up. I looked at him for a long moment. He was 25, maybe, and there was something in him that hadn't been fully formed yet by the kind of decisions that form men in one direction or another. And I could see that he was at one of those decisions right now, sitting across a dying fire in the northern Bitterroot with full knowledge of what he was walking away from. What do you want in return for that? I asked. Nothing, he said, with a directness that surprised me. He went back to the uncle's camp. They were gone by 7 the next morning. Natin appeared at my fire ring about 20 minutes after their voices faded to silence down the south trail. He sat without preamble. He poured himself a small amount of the herb preparation from his bark container. He sat with it. You lied to them, he said, not accusation, not approval, a fact that he was holding and examining. Yes, I said. And the young one knew. Yes. And chose not to pursue it. Yes. He was quiet. I couldn't read what he thought about this, which was unusual. After 4 days, I'd developed some ability to read him, but this was a particular silence that had layers to it I couldn't navigate. Complexity, maybe. The kind of surprise that a man has when the world fails to do the thing he'd been braced for. What will you do about the report? He asked. I haven't decided. The report for the commission. I know what you mean, I said. I haven't decided. He held his vessel of herb tea and looked at the fire ring. If you report the full find, he said, what happens? Survey Commission flags it. Territorial government issues exploration licenses. Prospectors, probably properly funded ones, not, I gestured south where Coyle and Petch had gone. Properly funded ones with lawyers and machinery. It gets assessed. If the assessment confirms what I think is there, I stopped. What? What I think is there is worth enough money that the assessment doesn't stay quiet, I said. Nothing that valuable stays quiet. People find out. People come. The licensing process. I stopped again because the licensing process was not what he needed me to describe. He knew what happened after the licensing process. Everyone who'd lived in the West long enough knew. And if you report nothing, he said, then the commission doesn't flag it. Coyle and Petch found nothing. Dressler's readings stay as an anomaly in a 5-year-old journal. This place stays, I looked at the trees, at the specific quality of them. Like this. For how long, he asked. I don't know, I said. Someone else finds it eventually, maybe, maybe not, maybe a long time. He was quiet. There's a third option, I said. He looked at me. A report that accurately describes the find, I said, but in a way that also accurately describes what this place is and what it has been and who has maintained it and why, and files that alongside the geological assessment in a way that is, not standard commission practice, not anything I've done before, but is attached to the record so that whatever happens next, there's a contemporaneous account of what was here first. He looked at me for a long time. That doesn't stop what comes, he said. No, I said, it doesn't stop it. But he stopped. Something moved across his face that was not grief exactly, but was the shape that sits next to grief when you've been carrying something and someone has just acknowledged its weight. It makes it visible. Yes, I said. Correctly seen, like you said. He set down the vessel. He picked up the stone, the piece of kimberlite, which is what I'd come to understand it was, a piece of the caprock indicator broken from its source by that 40 years ago ground event, and carried up into this man's hands, and kept there with the understanding that it was evidence of something that needed a witness. He turned it in his hands. "Write it," he said. "All of it. Write what the ground is, write what this place is, write who I am and what I've told you and what this stone is and what it means, and write it so that it cannot be," he stopped, searched, "so that it cannot be edited into something smaller than it is." "I'll need time," I said. "You have time," he said, "until you need to go south." "And the stone." He looked at it, then he held it out to me. "Take it," he said. He searched again, and in the searching I could see the weight of the word he was choosing. "As proof of what you were told, that it came from here, that someone who knew this place put it in the hands of someone who measured things for a living." I took it. It was heavier than it looked. It was cold in a way that went somewhere beyond the temperature of the air. "What do you want me to do with it?" I asked. "Whatever ensures that it cannot be called a lie," he said. I started writing. Not the log. The log was full of fragments and shorthand, the private record of a man trying to keep track of events that were happening faster than his interpretive capacity. What I started was a formal document. Formal in the way my reports were formal, precise language, dated observations, first-person attestations, but extended into territory that no survey report had required of me before. I wrote the geological assessment first because that was the ground I knew. The formation type, the surface expression, the radius measurement, the kimberlite indicator, the probable depth, and based on that depth and the magnetic signatures Dressler had recorded and my own observational data from 4 days at the site, the probable composition and extent of what was below. The number I arrived at, working from the geological evidence alone, was large enough that I wrote it, and then sat with it, and then wrote it again. Because numbers of that magnitude require a second pass to confirm that you haven't missed a decimal. 3 million was conservative. That's what I can say about that number. 3 million was what the land would yield if worked modestly, and if the pipe was at the lower end of what I thought it was. The upper end made 3 million feel like a conversation opener. Then I wrote the other part. I wrote Nathan. I wrote what he'd told me about this ground. Not the romanticized version, not the version that turns an Apache elder into a symbol, but the precise version. The specific bands, the specific generations of maintenance. The specific incident 40 years prior and what it had revealed and what had been understood from it. The stone circle and its non-Apache origin and the decision, made by people who understood that meaning and exclusivity are different things, to maintain what they'd found rather than claim it. I wrote his name. I wrote that he was here, in this place, in October of 1891, and that he had been the one to give me the piece of evidence I was submitting with the document. I wrote his exact words about what he wanted. That it be seen, correctly, not taken, not named, not enclosed, but seen. I wrote mine back to him. That doesn't stop what comes. And his, then at least it happened in the light. I wrote for 2 days. My hand cramps from cold and from the sustained output both, and I wrote through the cramps, stopping only when the light was gone and I couldn't make the letters reliable, and Nathan sat nearby and occasionally added something. A detail I'd gotten wrong, a name I'd misspelled, a relationship between 2 elements of the story that I'd missed, and was otherwise quiet. On the second day of writing, without ceremony, he got up and walked to the stone circle and sat in it, and didn't return until the following morning. I don't know what he did in there. I know what I heard, which was nothing, and what Cinder's body language said, which was attentiveness without alarm. And I know what the air felt like in the camp without him, which was, as though something had relocated, the way a sound relocates when the source moves, and the silence left behind is shaped differently than it was before. The document was 31 pages when I finished it. My handwriting is adequate under good conditions and had become, under these conditions, cold, cracked ribs, increasing food deprivation, somewhat character-filled. I went back through it once for legibility, adding clarifications in margins, and gave it a cover page in the formal style of commission reports, but with a different title than those reports usually bore. Report on geological and cultural significance of the northern Bitterroot Formation at coordinates, measured by pocket compass and estimated star position, with attached testimony regarding long-term stewardship of the site by indigenous maintainers, October 1891. C.M. Reardon, surveyor, Montana Territorial Survey Commission. I read it back. It was the most accurate thing I'd ever written. It was also the most likely to be received by the Commission in exactly the way that things which don't fit existing categories are received, which is, with the particular confusion of institutions that have very clear processes for some things and no process at all for others. I'd file it, I'd attach the stone as evidence and reference. I'd write a cover letter that used the specific language of precedent. There were 2 cases, one in the Dakota Territory, one in Colorado, where attached testimony from indigenous informants had been entered into the permanent survey record. Small footnotes in the institutional history of a commission that was mostly concerned with whether you'd found gold. And I'd use those precedents, and I'd file it in a way that required it to be addressed, and not simply set aside. It wouldn't stop what came, I knew that, Nathan knew that. But it would be there, in the record, in the light. When I handed it to Nathan, the full 31 pages wrapped in oilcloth from my saddlebag, he took it and held it the way he'd held the stone, with the weight of it, with the understanding of what it contained. "This is what you're giving them," he said, not a question. "This is what I'm giving the record," I said, "which is different from giving it to them." He turned it in his hands once. "My grandfather," he said, "believed that if a thing was seen clearly enough by enough people, it became harder to make disappear." He set the document down on the flat stone beside the stone circle. He lived long enough to know whether he was right, and he didn't tell anyone the answer. "What do you think?" I asked. He looked at the oilcloth packet for a long moment. "I think he was right about the harder," he said. "I know because the log says so, and the log says so because I made myself write it even though my hand was functioning at approximately 60%, and the cold had reached a stage where writing felt like an act of disagreement with the conditions rather than anything natural. October 11, 1891. Leaving. Ribs holding. Provision situation improved. That last note because Nathan had given me enough dried meat and a cake of compressed pine nut paste to sustain reasonable travel for 3 days, which was more than enough for the distance I had remaining, and the gift of which I had tried to refuse, and then stopped trying to refuse because he'd given it with the particular quality of someone who has already fully decided and is merely waiting for you to catch up. Cinder was ready before I was. He always was. He had a morning energy that didn't depend on temperature or season or the state of the human climbing onto his back, and on October 11th he was standing at the edge of the clearing with his ears forward and his weight balanced and an expression that communicated, as clearly as anything I'd read from him in 3 years. "We're going today, and I'm fine with that, and also could we go?" I strapped the oilcloth document into the saddlebag, with the kind of care I hadn't given anything since the Winchester I'd traded to Follow's water. The stone, the piece of kimberlite, I wrapped separately in what remained of the wool blanket, which had finally dried in the last 3 days and regained approximately half of its original structural integrity, and I placed it against my body, inside my coat, where the warmth of my core would keep it from the cold, and where it pressed against my left side with a weight I found, weirdly, not uncomfortable. I found Nathan at the stone circle, standing again at the eastern edge. I came to the edge of it myself and stood there. Neither of us said anything for a moment. "You'll be at the river by nightfall," he said. "Easier going from there south." "I know it," I said. "The commission?" He said it without inflection, the way you say the name of a weather system, something large and impersonal whose behavior you can predict but not control. "They will receive this." "They'll receive it," I said. "What they do with it?" I stopped. "I'll put it in front of someone specific, not just file it into the general pile. There's a man, geologist named Haverson. He was on the Dakota testimony case. He'll understand what he's reading." Nathan nodded, slowly, with the weight of a man accepting not a solution but a best available option, which is a particular kind of acceptance that takes more strength than accepting a good outcome. "And after?" he asked. "After," I said. "I don't know after. The document is there. The testimony is there." "What they do with it," I exhaled. "What I can do is file it correctly and refuse to let them tell me it was filed incorrectly. Beyond that," I shook my head. "I'm one surveyor with a 31-page document and a piece of evidence and a record that isn't standard practice." He looked at me. "That's not nothing," he said. "No," I said, "it's not nothing." He didn't say more than that. He turned back to face east, which was the position I'd first found him in, the listening position, and I understood that we were done with words and that the doneness of it was complete and didn't require anything further. Not a handshake, we didn't. Not a formal leave-taking. Just the understanding that what had happened here was concluded, and what happened from here was in other hands, which is either a terrifying fact or a manageable one depending on how much you trust other hands. I walked back to Cinder. He turned his head and pressed his nose against the back of my neck. I stood still for a moment. Then I mounted and we went south. I didn't look back at the clearing. I've asked myself since why I didn't, and the best answer I've been able to arrive at is that looking back would have been for my sake and not for his, and he hadn't asked for it. And in the absence of an ask, I let the moment close the way it needed to close, which was me going south, him staying, the trees receiving both things without comment. Cinder moved differently going south than he had going north. Going north, following whatever he'd been following, whatever the ground produced that horses feel before men do, he'd had the specific fluency of a horse that knows its direction. Going south, he was compliant and forward and smooth and professional about it, the way he was about most things when he'd accepted the direction, and underneath the compliance was not resistance but something else. Not reluctance, something more like remainder. The quality that stays in a room after someone leaves it, briefly, before it dissipates. He'd found what he'd been going back to find. Now we were going away from it. I thought about Follow's Water, who'd given me this horse for a Winchester and a promise. I thought about what Follow's Water had known about him that he hadn't told me, because Follow's Water was the kind of man who knew things about horses that exceeded what he was willing to explain. I thought about the 3 years Cinder and I had been in each other's company, and what I'd understood, across those 3 years, about the particular intelligence that lives in an animal that is not human and is not lesser. I thought about the piece of kimberlite pressing against my ribs, the injured ones specifically, because I'd placed it on the wrong side in the dark, and whether the pressure of it was helping or hurting, and decided it was doing something in between that was hard to name. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached the Bitterroot River. Nathan was right about the going. The river valley was easier, less timber, and the trail on the east bank was well enough maintained by the seasonal traffic between the northern settlements and Fort Missoula that I could make time without the constant navigation the upper forest had required. I stopped once to let Cinder drink and to eat a portion of the pine nut cake, which had a dense, slightly resinous flavor that I found somewhere between unpleasant and completely sustaining, which seemed about right. I wrote in the log while he drank, "River reached. Document safe, stone with me, 4 days, maybe 3 if pace holds. Think about Haverson, think about how to write the cover letter." Then below that, after a pause, think about what correct looks like. What it does. Then after another pause, Cinder knew, before I did, maybe that's the story. The cover letter to Haverson took me the entire 3rd day's travel to compose in my head, and another hour that evening by the fire to write. And when I had it, I read it back twice and changed it significantly both times and then wrote it a 3rd time and stopped changing it, which is my personal threshold for a piece of writing being done, when the changes I want to make are the same as the changes I've already made. It was not a standard commission cover letter. It was not, honestly, the kind of letter that advances a professional relationship with the easy efficiency that professional relationships require. It was, instead, the kind of letter that a man writes when he's decided that the professional relationship is going to have to absorb something it wasn't designed for, and when he trusts the specific human in question to be capable of absorbing it. I'd worked with Haverson on one previous report, the iron ore survey below the Anaconda Divide, 3 years prior, which had resulted in a straightforward filing and a licensing action that I'd signed off on without any of the complexity I was now bringing to him. He was a careful man, a methodical man, a man who, in the one conversation I'd had with him about the Dakota testimony case, had said something I'd filed away and was now retrieving. The record is the record. Once it's in there correctly, it's very difficult to make it say something it doesn't say. The record has no investment in any particular outcome. I'd thought at the time that this was a somewhat naive statement about how institutions process information. I now thought it was possibly the most strategically sound piece of advice I'd ever received. The cover letter said, in its final form, "I am filing a geological assessment of a northern Bitterroot formation that, in my professional judgment, represents a find of significant economic value. I'm also filing, as an attached and inseparable component of this assessment, a testimony document attesting to the prior and ongoing stewardship of the site by indigenous maintainers, without whose knowledge the geological assessment would be substantially less complete. Both documents should be received and filed together, as the geological conclusions depend materially on information provided in the testimony. I am submitting a physical evidence sample along with the documents. I will present these in person. Short, professional, structured so that separating the two documents would require an active decision rather than a passive one, which is, in institutional terms, an important distinction. I sealed it in the oilcloth with the report. I kept the stone on my person. Fort Missoula on October 14th was its usual organized chaos. Supply wagons, soldiers, the miscellaneous population of a frontier outpost that is simultaneously a military installation and a transit hub, and a de facto center of everything that has no other center within 100 miles. I was not, in this context, a remarkable sight. A man arriving on a good horse with minimal gear and obvious weather damage was a Tuesday in Fort Missoula. I found a commission agent on the third inquiry. Filed the documents, both of them in the oilcloth together with the cover letter, and watched the agent receive them with the efficient disinterest of someone managing a high volume of paperwork, and gave him Haverson's name and noted, in the handoff, that the filing was associated with a material evidence submission that required secure handling. He wrote down the material evidence note. He gave me a receipt. He set the oilcloth packet in a wooden box with other oilcloth packets and official papers, and went back to whatever he'd been doing before I arrived. I stood for a moment. Then I went to find a meal that wasn't pine nut cake. The stone I kept. I'd thought about this for the entire ride south, whether to include it with the filing. Whether its presence in a commission evidence box would help or hurt the reception of the documents. Whether removing it from the site and presenting it without context would strip it of the meaning Nathan had attached to it when he handed it to me, or whether the meaning traveled with it. I decided that its presence with me, physical in my possession, was more useful than its presence in a box, for reasons I was still articulating. It was proof, as he'd said. Evidence that someone who knew the place had put it in my hands deliberately. But it was also, and this took me longer to be honest about, the thing that made the experience real in a way that my own memory could not guarantee. Memory is editable. Memory softens and shifts and accommodates what you need it to. A piece of cold, heavy, translucent stone that does things with firelight that stone is not supposed to do. That doesn't edit. I wanted to keep it somewhere the editing couldn't reach it. I kept it. Haverson received me in Helena 2 weeks after the filing. He was a tall man with a systematic quality about him that extended to his office, everything in its place, papers in identifiable categories, the desktop clear of everything except what he was currently working on. He had the document open when I arrived. Both documents. The stone was between them on the desk, which told me he'd handled it, turned it, looked at it, and put it down with intention. He didn't stand when I came in. He looked up from the document and said, "Sit." I sat. "The Kimberlite assessment," he said. "Yes. Your methodology is sound. The radius measurement is unorthodox. No transit, no chain, but your footnote about the stride estimate and the tree-lean geometry is," he paused. "Convincing. I checked your math." "I know," I said. "I had time." "If your formation estimate is correct," he said, "this is one of the largest pipe signatures on record in the territory." "I think the estimate is conservative," I said. He looked at me for a moment, then at the document, then back. "Your cover letter said the testimony is not separable from the geological assessment." "That's correct." "You're aware that's not? There's no commission precedent for." "There are 2 cases," I said. "Dakota, 1886, Colorado Territory, 1884, you know both." He did. I watched him know both. "Those were different circumstances," he said. "They established the principle," I said. "That the principle is inconvenient in this case doesn't change that it's established." He looked at me for a long moment. He had the expression of a man doing multiple calculations simultaneously, which I recognized because I do it too, and because watching another person do it is uncomfortably familiar. "The Commission will want to issue exploration licenses," he said. "The Commission can issue exploration licenses," I said. with the testimony on record in the file permanently, so that when the licensing history of this site is reviewed, at any point, by any party, the record includes not just the geological find, but the prior stewardship and its nature and its duration, and the name of the man who maintained it. That won't protect the site, he said. No, I said, it won't protect the site. He exhaled, long, through his nose. You know what you're asking me to do is going to make things difficult. I know what I'm asking you to do is correct, I said. I'm asking you to receive a filing correctly. That's not a request for difficulty. That's a request for your job. His eyes did something I couldn't fully read. Not offense, something closer to the specific discomfort of a principled man being asked to act on his principles when doing so is inconvenient. He looked at the stone. He picked it up. He held it the way everyone held it, with an awareness that it was heavier than expected, and that what was happening with the light inside it was not normal. Where did he get this? He asked. The ground opened, I said. 40 years ago, he or his father collected it then. 40 years ago, Haverson said. Before Dressler, before the magnetic survey, before anything in our records. He set it down. I'll process the filing, he said, both documents together, the stone as submitted evidence catalogued and held with the file. He picked up a pen, set it down again. I can't guarantee what the commission does with the licensing. I'm not asking you to, I said. I'm asking you to guarantee that the record is the record. He looked at me. Once it's in there correctly, I said, it's very difficult to make it say something it doesn't say. He recognized his own words. Something moved across his face. Where are you going after this? He asked. Home, I said, if I still have one, and then I have a report to write to someone. He didn't ask who, he just nodded. The letter to Nathan took 4 attempts. The first 2 were too much about the process. The commission, the filing, the Haverson meeting, and not enough about what I actually wanted to say, which was a thing that letters are sometimes bad at carrying and which I kept circling without landing on directly. The third attempt was too much about what I felt, which is the opposite failure, the kind that makes a private thing public in a way that neither party asked for. The fourth one was this. The documents are filed, both, together. The record is complete. The stone is with the file, it will stay with it. The man who processed the filing is a careful man who understands what the record is for. The licensing will happen. I think you knew that. I want to tell you something that may or may not matter. In 11 days, your ground was the first thing I've surveyed in 4 years that I wrote about accurately. That sounds small. It isn't. It's the only kind of accurate that produces a record that can't be edited. Cinder is well. He went south without complaint. I think he's finished with that particular direction. I don't know where to send this, so I'll put it with my own records. The log, it'll be there. CMR. I don't know if he ever read it. I put it in the log where I said I would, and I've read it back enough times in the years since that the page has gone soft at the fold. The commission issued exploration licenses the following spring, March 1892. The formation was assessed by a proper mineralogical team that summer and confirmed at the upper end of my estimate, which meant the 3 million figure that entered circulation in the Helena papers was, as I'd predicted, a floor. The assessment report cited my preliminary work. The assessment report did not reference the testimony document. I went back to Haverson. He showed me the file. The testimony was there. Both pages of the heading were stamped, received Territorial Commission, October 1891, and the physical evidence notation referenced the stone by its catalog number. It was in the file. It was, as I'd said, in the record. It's not being cited in the licensing documentation, I said. No, he said. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Then, because citing it would require the licensing documents to address it, and addressing it would require the commission to have a policy for what it means, and the commission doesn't have that policy yet. Yet, I noticed the word. I think he put it there intentionally. But it's there, I said. It's there, he said, permanently. Stamped and catalogued and cross-referenced to the licensing file, so that any review of the site's history will include it. And when someone comes looking, they'll find it, he said. That's what the record does, it waits. I rode back through the northern Bitterroot in September of 1892. Not to the clearing. I didn't know if going back was mine to do, and I didn't try to navigate to it directly. But I was in that range on survey work again, the first commission assignment I'd taken since the previous fall, and the range has a specific quality in September. The light coming through the ponderosa in a way that has a particular color that I've never successfully described to anyone who hasn't been in it. Cinder, on the second day in the range, lifted his head toward the northeast. The familiar direction, the familiar quality of the lifting. I watched him. He held the direction for a long time, ears forward, nostrils working. That specific intentness that was not alarm and not hunger and not any of the things I'd learned to categorize in 3, now 4, years of reading him. Then he lowered his head, put it back to the work of the trail, kept going south where I'd pointed him without further comment. I pulled out the log. I wrote, he knows it's still there. Whatever the ground produces that horses feel, still there. I think he just wanted to confirm it. Then I wrote, the record is the same, it waits. Then I closed the log and we kept going. I have one more thing to say about this. In 1904, 13 years after the Bitterroot Formation was assessed and licensed and extracted from, the operation ran for 6 years before the accessible diamond-bearing material in the primary pipe was largely depleted. A land return petition was filed with the newly constituted Federal Land Commission. The petition referenced a document in the Montana Territorial Survey Commission records. The document was dated October 1891. It described the prior stewardship of the formation by indigenous maintainers, included a named testimony, and had been submitted contemporaneously with the initial geological assessment by one C.M. Reardon, surveyor. The petition cited it as evidence of prior legitimate claim. The petition was not successful, but it was filed, it was heard. The document was read into the official record of the hearing by a clerk in a room with 20 people in it, 13 of whom had not known it existed until that morning. I was not in that room. I was alive and elsewhere, and I read about it in a letter from Haverson, who had retired by then but had followed the case and wrote with the specific tone of a careful man who is accounting for a thing he did and noting, without excessive emphasis, that the accounting came out to something. I don't know where Nathan was by 1904. I've never known. What I know is what was in the log. What I know is that he handed me a piece of ground that had been waiting a very long time to be seen correctly by someone who measured things for a living. And that Cinder knew where it was before I did. And that on a September morning in 1892, heading south on a well-maintained river trail in early turning mountain light, my horse lifted his head northeast for one long moment, and then, with the patience of an animal that understands what it means to know a place exists even when you're not in it, put his head back down and kept going,